morning, and thank you everyone for joining us on this beautiful day. I would like to welcome you all to the virtual conference of the Royal Irish Academy. This event was organised by the Engineering and Computer Sciences Committee, working in collaboration with the Climate Change and Environmental Sciences Committee. Its aim is to encourage debate and discussion and to highlight areas that are of strategic importance as Ireland strives to reach its 2030 Climate Action Plan targets. First of all, I would like to thank the members of the organising committee for their time and expertise in developing this important event. Mr. P.J. Rudden of Angus Consulting, Professor John Ringwood, and Ms. Carrie Barry of the Centre for Ocean Energy Research at Maynooth University, and Ms. Geraldine Cusack, EU Sustainability Director at Ardagh Group. I would also like to thank the Environmental Protection Agency and Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland for their support for this event. The challenges of addressing climate change are complex and multifaceted, and no single event could address them all. The Academy's International Affairs Conference last April addressed the climate emergency from an international policy perspective, and it focused on human rights and social justice. Today's proceedings will address climate action from an engineering perspective, focusing on the decarbonisation and sustainability of Ireland's energy and transport sectors. Ireland's decarbonisation pathway to 2030, as set out in the Climate Action Plan, requires that ambitious targets be met in electricity, transport and heating by 2030. This programme of transformation is now urgent as the 2020 targets fell significantly short for transport and heating, while renewable energy in electricity was progressing. There is growing pressure politically and from civic society to accelerate the progress to achieve the targets. And so we are honoured today to be joined by distinguished experts to discuss how the challenges of implementing the Paris Agreement can be addressed in Ireland by green infrastructure and technologies and by economic and social strategies. We are also delighted to welcome a diverse audience with people joining us from government, from academic departments, industry, NGOs, the media, and the general public. As President of the Royal Irish Academy, I would like to express a warm welcome in particular to our keynote speaker, Minister for Transport, Environment, Climate and Communications, Eamon Ryan. Minister, I look forward to hearing from you today. First, though, I am going to hand over to today's chair, Professor John FitzGerald, member of the Royal Irish Academy. One of Ireland's best-known economists, Professor FitzGerald's work centres on macroeconomic policy and energy policy. He is a member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council, which he chaired for 5 years from its inception in 2015. He is an adjunct professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin and of electrical and electronic engineering at UCD, where he is a board member for both the UCD Energy Institute and UCD ICRAG. He is a former research professor and programs coordinator of macroeconomics in ESRI. He was previously a member of the Commission of the Central Bank of Ireland, of the National Economic Social Council, and the Board of Northern Ireland's Authority for Energy Regulation. He chaired the Renewable Energy Strategy Group for the Department of Public Enterprise, and he was a member of the EU Group for Economic Analysis from 2002 to 2004. He advised the President of the EU Commission on matters of economic policy. He was also a member of the Irish Energy Research Council, the Independent Water Review Panel of Northern Ireland, and of the Irish government's high-level group on green enterprise. John has published extensively on fiscal policy and the behaviour of the Irish economy, and on energy and climate policy. So without further ado, it's over to you, John.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning to everybody. For 235 years, almost a quarter of a millennium, the RIA has brought together Irish researchers and scholars across what the founders referred to as the sciences, polite literature, and antiquities. More recently, the RIA has interpreted polite literature to include engineering, social sciences, and the humanities in a joint endeavour with physical scientists to understand the multiple challenges that we as a society face. Across the disciplines, this work uses the best available evidence to help us understand how to proceed. The topic of today's conference, how to achieve our urgent goal of tackling climate change, is an unusual policy challenge. Tackling it will require the mobilization of the wisdom of a very large number of different disciplines. A model of the development of scientific research has been the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which brings together scientists from all over the world to crystallize their collective wisdom on what is driving climate change and on the challenge climate change poses for the human race. Here in Ireland, the RIA plays such a role, bringing together those working in climate science and related disciplines to help us understand the juggernaut that is climate change and more specifically its implications for Ireland. Climate change has already begun to disrupt lives all over the globe, and a further major disruption is inevitable, even with dramatic action today to halt climate change after 2050. The work of Irish scientists spelling out the implications for Ireland is hugely important. This conference is one of a series of events the RIA has staged to bring together the collective wisdom of researchers to help Ireland achieve its ambition of becoming climate neutral by 2050. Previous events have focused on climate science. This conference is focused on how development in energy efficiency, buildings, transport, and electricity and heat will ensure that Ireland will be climate neutral by 2050. No doubt a future RIA conference will look at the agricultural sector, which accounts for 35% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But that is not a subject for discussion today. One of the important roles of the RIA plays in bringing the results of the best scientific research to the attention of policymakers in Ireland. In turn, the Irish political system takes scientific research seriously, though it has thus far been very slow to take action. The limited progress to date is not because of climate deniers in the Dáil. Instead, nearly all politicians take the conclusions of scientific research seriously, even if they don't always follow it. In turn, politicians reflect the priorities of the electorate. An editorial 2 years ago in the popular science magazine Scientific American bemoaned the fact that there were almost no scientists members of the US House of Representatives. By contrast, we are governed by a more diverse political class, many of them qualified in a range of different disciplines, including the sciences. This makes a difference and means that progress in tackling climate change faces fewer obstacles here than in countries with a more sceptical political class. However, in modern Ireland, policymaking is a complex process, extending way beyond the houses of the Oireachtas and the civil service. Civil society plays a vital role in deciding what policies are actively pursued. For this reason, researchers need to communicate their results and their advice to the wider public. It is not sufficient to publish key findings in academic journals and rely on these results finding their way to the civil service and the wider public by osmosis. Today's conference is part of this vital direct channel, whereby researchers communicate their findings to an interested public as well as formally to key policymakers. Scientific and technological research must play a vital role in helping Ireland and the rest of the world to meet the Paris goals. If the only way to meet those goals was to dramatically reduce our standard of living, it would be a huge task for the people of Ireland. The challenge would be even greater for developing countries, which aspire to a world where the UN Sustainable Development Goals are met for all countries and peoples. Instead, we have the opportunity of using science and technology to help us make the necessary changes. The role of the developed world is to pay for the research and the development of the vital new technologies that allow decarbonisation. The developing world will then adopt these technologies when they become the cheap option. This will be vital in getting buy-in across the world. The research and development of the necessary technologies will come at a price. Given the speed with which technologies may develop, this cost is likely to be no more than a few percentage points of national output. However, it is important to recognize the cost and to work to minimize it. Failure to do so will jeopardize the policies essential to a successful transition. However, given the costs will be spread out over 3 decades, investing for a sustainable Ireland should not pose a problem if handled appropriately. The programme for government, recognising the urgency of the situation, has substantially raised our ambition for reducing greenhouse gases by 2030. This increased ambition reflects a similar development at the level of the EU. What is needed now are the detailed measures which will make the ambition a reality, and Panel 1 will focus on this issue. The one sector where Ireland has made significant progress over the last decade is in reducing emissions in the electricity sector. The deployment of renewables over the last 15 years, now accounting for almost 40% of electricity generation, came at almost no cost for consumers. And I think that this was interesting and a real success story. Nonetheless, our emissions per head from electricity are still higher than in the UK and Spain. However, it is planned to generate 70% of electricity from renewables by 2030. If achieved, it will make a major change in Ireland's ranking the sector and play a vital role in decarbonising Ireland, given the importance that electricity will play in other sectors such as heat and transport. Today, we will hear about the challenges which this target poses, and most importantly, how we will overcome them. This will require significant investment, though the long-term cost to consumers will probably be limited. However, undertaking a major investment programme of this type will pose other challenges in terms of project management and gaining the necessary acceptance. I look forward to hearing some of the answers to these challenges in Panel 2. Transport accounts for 20% of Irish emissions, and emissions per head in Ireland amount to 2.5 tonnes per year, much higher than in many other EU countries such as the UK, Germany, France, and Spain. And one reason for the lower emissions in other EU countries is their denser development, allowing large-scale use of public transport, whereas we use cars for commuting. I look forward to hearing how scientific research and technological development will help us decarbonise the sector in Ireland. New technologies will be needed. However, as we will probably increase the number of dwellings in Ireland by over 40% by 2050, we have an opportunity to build sustainable cities and towns. Implementing the National Planning Framework will therefore have a very important role guiding that development. However, the changes wrought by the pandemic may not necessarily make the required densification of development any easier. And I look forward to hearing the results of research on this topic to be presented in the 4th panel this afternoon. Energy efficiency in buildings is the topic of the 3rd panel. This sector is the one where Ireland lags most behind our EU partners in the household sector. Emissions per head in this sector in Ireland and in Northern Ireland are 50% higher than the UK and Germany. And they are 3 times the emissions per head in Denmark and Spain. Now, Spain has the advantage that they probably don't need as much heating as we do, but Denmark does. So we are way behind the curve on this one. Tackling this problem is clearly a major challenge for domestic policy. Unless new and innovative ways are found to make the household sector carbon neutral, households may have to invest up to 50 billion between now and 2050 in retrofitting their homes. This will soak up considerable resources in the building and construction sector, which itself will be a macroeconomic issue. Policy will need to focus on making this task as easy as possible for households, and this will include assistance in finance and project management. Also, there may be a range of possible solutions involving different mixes of retrofitting, heat pumps, green hydrogen, and biomass. Finding the right mix is a challenge that I hope to understand better after I have heard the speakers in panel 3 this afternoon. As I've mentioned, between now and 2050, we will need to increase our stock of dwellings by over 40%, with related dramatic increase in commercial buildings. Around 8% of the world's emissions of greenhouse gases are accounted for by cement, and a similar figure is accounted for by steel production. If technological development can allow us to dramatically cut the carbon dioxide needed to build the new Ireland, it could save a few years' greenhouse gas emissions on the way to 2050. Research in Cambridge University has shown that you can build commercial buildings with wood. Building an experimental 300 square meter wooden building generated 130 tons of carbon dioxide. If it had been built with concrete, it would have generated 310 tons, over twice as much, while a steel-based building would have generated 500 tons of carbon dioxide, over 4 times as much. In addition, the wood building had 540 tons of carbon locked up in the timber used in its construction, and that is there for the structure's lifetime. So it is a route to sustainable buildings, and given the number of buildings that we're going to build, is really important. This is an example of technological development where a whole range of disciplines are essential. Architects and engineers, obviously, material scientists, chemists, physicists, botanists, and agricultural scientists are needed, as well as social scientists, economists, sociologists, and psychologists to make it happen. That's why an RIA conference is the place to discuss some of these issues. Across Europe and the US, timber is the norm in many housing developments, unlike in Ireland. 2 years ago, up to 20% of new houses in Ireland were already timber frame structures. This very important progress, replacing carbon dioxide-rich cement with carbon-fixing timber, is being halted because the state has not dealt with the obstacle of timber supply in Ireland constituted by the licensing regime in forestry. We need to immediately deal with this administrative barrier that is preventing vital innovation in the building sector. It is also a huge obstacle to changing land use from activities that emit greenhouse gases to forestry, which sucks carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This administrative failure is not only contributing to higher greenhouse gas emissions, but it is also raising the cost of housing for everybody, a lose-lose for society. If we are serious about tackling climate change, the licensing regime for forestry should be abolished tomorrow morning. It should be replaced by a regulation-based regime run by the EPA, the kind of regime that applies across the rest of the land use and agricultural sector. And such a regulatory regime can deliver on the other environmental goals, such as biodiversity, without preventing progress on forestry and construction using wood. Adaptation is a vital challenge, but one which we tend to forget and concentrate on mitigating or dealing with the problem of our emissions of greenhouse gases. Every year brings new evidence that climate change is happening and that we need not only to halt its progress, but to take major action to protect our lives and our lifestyles from its consequences. The disastrous polar vortex, which hit the US 2 weeks ago, showed up the vulnerability of the state of Texas to disruption to its energy systems. As we electrify transport and heating, we will become ever more dependent as a society on electricity. This will greatly raise the importance of securing the electricity supply from extreme weather events, and it is an issue which may be addressed in panel 2. Think if all our vehicles, ambulances and fire brigade, the police vehicles are all electrified, and all our heating is electrified, and if we lose electricity for 2 days because of an event, the consequences could be disastrous. So the issue of securing ourselves against the consequences of climate change really is important. And it's something that I think policy undervalues. And understanding this is something where we particularly need Irish scientists who can explain to us what the consequences of climate change are for Ireland. We can't rely on the research being done for the United States or for Africa. Irish research in this area is essential. Protecting ourselves from future flooding and sea level rise will be a major challenge for the built environment. And the transport sector is exposed in a similar manner to the depredations caused by a warming planet. So this is something that all sectors have got to take seriously. And I think something which we as a society haven't to date taken account of adequately. And the range of experts here today can also make a major contribution in helping us to adapt to these changes that are coming down the tracks over the coming decades as a result of climate change. And now I want to conclude. The last 18 months has seen a major change in Ireland, with much greater urgency being attached to tackling climate change by the new government, by the Oireachtas. The Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change, the last Oireachtas and in the current Oireachtas, are really taking this issue seriously. Significant innovations have already been made, including the commitment to a rising carbon tax, measures to ramp up the retrofitting of social housing, careful attention being paid to ensuring a just transition involving workers who lose their jobs, and also people on low incomes who may be adversely affected. So action is being taken. However, more needs to be done. I particularly welcome the Minister to this conference. He himself has an exceptional understanding of many of the technical issues to be discussed here today. He's been at many of these conferences over the last decade or 15 years, so he understands many of the issues very well. As Minister, he has shown an understanding of the urgency of the problem, of the need for innovative solutions, and a real enthusiasm for tackling the problem and finding solutions that maximize the long-term benefits for Irish society. So over to you, Minister.
Good morning, John, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. I should start first of all by maybe returning the compliment to yourself, John, for your kind words there, and to thank you for the work you've done as chair of our Climate Committee, or Climate Advisory Committee, and your willingness to continue to serve on that with Marie Donnelly now taking over as chair. I think it has served a hugely important role, and I think it will be central to what comes next. And I might explain that in some of the remarks I'm about to make. I'm going to give a very broad overview, and my understanding is that there is room for questions, or I'm kind of, I don't know whether, whatever the format is, but I'm happy to try and provide for that if that's allowable within the format. It's so difficult. We're all remote and locked down, but I'm locked down in a very nice office in government building, so I can't complain. In Charlie Hawley's old office, it's a palace. And one of three offices I had the great pleasure of attending, two others in the two departments I have responsibility for. And I might just start on those two in their responsibility for the task we have ahead of us. It's an incredible challenge. I don't think, John, you'd know, I don't think there's been another country which has halved its emissions in a decade, but that's what we're trying to do. That's the challenge we're setting ourselves. It's unprecedented, but it is set on the basis of it's what the science says that we should be aiming to do. The Paris Climate Agreement sets the target of trying to reduce temperature, global average temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. And the best UNFCCC and IPCC reports indicate, well, to achieve that goal, developed countries like Ireland should be halving its emissions by 2030 and should be net zero at least by 2050. So that's our goal. It's very similar now to the European ambition, which we will go to Glasgow in November to try and get wider increase in ambition. 55% reduction in emissions, as best we can expect, and no uncertain. The Irish share of that responsibility will be about 45%. So what we're setting as our own government target, yes, is more ambitious than that, but not wildly out of kilter with what we're going to have to do as part of our European commitment anyway. It has to be a change for the better. It has to be a change which delivers a better economy. It can't be just a punitive kind of finger wagging, telling people what to do. It has to be something that comes from the bottom up because it delivers a better system. In transport, I think that's very possible. We have already in the existing 2019 Climate Action Plan, very radical ambition, really, when you think about it, to switch our car fleet to electric vehicles. And they're better vehicles. That is a better way to go. there's fewer moving parts, there's much less maintenance costs. The fuel cost, well, the fuel comes from here. It's not imported over long distance. It doesn't bring air quality problems. They're better engines. They respond, they're better torque. In every way, they're better vehicles. Fuel cost is about a fifth of what the gasoline version is. So that's not a hardship, that's moving to a better system. We are also blending in fuels, fluids, biofuels, biogas and other, but I think we've done that quite successfully in the last decade, and the extent of further use of such fuels is probably limited because of the land use effects, particularly from biodiesel or plant oil. So yes, we will continue to do that, but it's limited by ecological limits in terms of what we can do. So to go further, and it's interesting, we have had we've started a series of 5 cabinet subcommittees to look at this issue. How do we get to 51% reduction? We started on Monday with electricity. I'll come to that, but I was working yesterday with our transport department saying, so what more do we need to do? What's the additional measures? And I think there are many we'll look at, but there are 2 really significant ones. One is to reduce the amount of travel we do, to reduce the demand. And that's easier said than done, but it is going to lead to a better economy. We all know that we've created a development model, a dispersed development model, that's not serving our purposes at this stage. It started with very good intentions to clear the slums in the centre of our cities, running away from viruses at the time, typhoid and cholera. And it worked when we moved out to Finglas or to Fairview and Crumlin and Drimna and so on. But we kept going out to Tala and Finglas and Blanchardstown, and then we kept going again out to Ratoath and Gorey, and we can't keep going out. And the same applies in Cork, Limerick, Waterford, all our cities. We've hollowed out our cities, and we need to moving back into the centre. We need to implement the National Planning Framework, which says better balanced regional development, more compact development, and low carbon development, and they go together. Niall Cousins gave a very good presentation, our planning regulator, to the Joint Oireachtas Transport Commission on Tuesday, saying exactly this. And that's going to be probably, in my mind, the most important means for us getting further transport emissions reductions. Won't be easy, as I said, because we're already still, even though we have the National Planning Framework to guide us in the other direction, we're still building out. Half the new houses being built at the moment are in the surrounding counties to Dublin. We have to go back into the centre of Cork, Waterford, Limerick, and so on, and Dublin. And how we do that is we invest in public transport and concentrate on what I call transport-led development. It's a common term, but it's recognizing you put in the particularly rail-based transport systems and you direct the housing around those. We can do that with the Metro, with the Bus Connects project, with the DART Plus program in Dublin. And for me, critical next investment is in Metropolitan Cork rail network along the existing rail lines from Middleton to Mallow, and a similar Bus Connects, possibly light rail line on the south side from Ballincollig right through the centre docks to Mahon. And the same in Limerick. We have 4 existing rail lines. So using the existing infrastructure, put in a metropolitan rail network system in Limerick that concentrates the future development in Limerick around new stations. Around Cobert Station, for starters, the LDA are doing really good work in that area, but then a network right across the city along those 4 existing rail lines. The benefit of that approach is the infrastructure is already there, planning is much easier, costs are significantly lower, can be delivered much more quickly in time for us to give clear signal to the local authorities that that's where you put the housing. Compact, dense development close to public transport infrastructure is what we need to do, and we reduce the demand for travel, the volume of travel we do as a way of cutting emissions. Secondly, and at the same time, we do a modal shift. We shift away from the private use of the car towards that use of public transport, but also active travel. I think there's huge potential for us to mimic and replicate and follow what the Danes and Dutch and others have done, where in their cities they have up to 30, 40% now of all trips being done by cycling, and really supporting pedestrian activity as well. Again, in more compact, dense development, urban development. So that's all where modern economies are going, where modern cities and towns and villages are going. Those towns that have done it are the ones that are succeeding. You look at Clonakilty, where they've created that sense of really attractive public realm in the centre, really good pedestrian facilities. That's where investment is going. That's where new housing is going. That's where people want to live. That's what we need to do in every town in this country. Secondly, and I'm going to have to fly through because I'm very conscious of time, is to go to the energy side. And I'm only just picking a couple of examples of where what we're going to do is going to be better. In the energy side, that's particularly clear. The ambitions in the 2019 plan were already very ambitious, beyond compare. John, you know it, that it's easier to say in one thing, oh, we're going to have 70% renewable electricity. I'm in government buildings, which was the School of Engineering in UCD back in the day. It is the greatest engineering challenge we face, to work out how both at the distribution grid, we get this variable power supply into our homes where we have car charging, heat pumps, as well as the other electricity demands. That's an incredible engineering challenge. And on the transmission side, transmission network side, how you balance 70% renewable power in a synchronized, isolated island system is beyond compare the engineering challenge of our time. But in solving that challenge, and we will challenge it, in recent weeks, I think, did I hear Mark Foley saying that earlier on in the week, that we were up to 80% instantaneous. John, you know that there were engineers 5 or 10 years ago, 3 years ago, who would have told you that that wasn't possible, that it wasn't physically possible. We were going beyond we were going into the realms of science fiction. Well, we're doing it. And in learning by doing, we will develop a really efficient, competitive, low carbon energy system that will be an attractor for investment into our country, because future manufacturers will not be able to go manufacture products based on a high carbon fuel supply source. And if we have this really high quality, synchronized renewable system, that's going to power our economy and not just ensure a secure energy system, but ensure a secure industrial base for this country, in my mind. And we can do it. We have some of the windiest conditions in the world, which helps. It helps that offshore wind energy in particular is now being seen as an energy source of scale that there's now industrialized development opportunities across not just Europe, but Asia and North America as well. And as I said, our sea area happens to be 10 times our land area. It's one of the windiest areas in the world. And critically, we do this not as an isolated island, but part of a Northwest European electricity grid system, because that's how we will make the engineering work, in my mind. It will be balanced through interconnection with the UK, with the continent, in an integrated electricity market. And no matter what happens with Brexit and all the difficulties we're going to have to manage and deliver and cope with it, my sense, the politics of this, is the UK are going to want to, and the rest of Europe will want them in that Northwest European regional electricity market, because it really makes sense. It doesn't work if we try and do this on a fragmented basis for anyone. The second easy and really ambitious figure in the climate action plan, the existing one, is for 500,000 houses to have deep retrofit by 2030, 50,000 houses a year, where we're currently might be doing about 1,000 or 2,000. So that's the scale up that we have to do is beyond compare. What makes me confident we can do that, there are various things. Well, firstly, COVID will help in the sense that all those people now remote working at home have maybe a stronger sense that it would be a good idea to be in a warm, comfortable home, particularly if we're going to be doing this remote working more. But there's real political will behind it. This is not going to stop and start. Every political party agrees to it. We started to invest in the apprenticeship schemes to create the workers who will deliver it. We will, in the Recovery and Resilience Fund, look for funding backed up by the EIB for loan guarantee systems that de-risk the lending that will be required to do this in private homes, and to reduce the cost of those loans to start to make the economics work, which will be helped by the commitment, now the law and commitment to law, that we're going to gradually increase our carbon tax each year to so that the financing of that retrofitting really does start to make sense. Just two, I'll be very brief and go on just two other areas that I want to focus on, the politics. But before that, just the whole issue of farming and land use, because that's probably the most politically contentious one. But again, one where I'm absolutely clear that the future of Irish farming is going to be in low carbon, biodiversity rich, low pollution, high water quality, low ammonia, low nitrogen future. We could bet on the opposite. We could bet on, we want to go intensify, further intensification with tolerating the polluted waters and the destruction of nature that's taking place at the current time. But what I'm constantly saying to my agriculture and other colleagues is I don't think the people are going to buy that. I don't think the people will buy our food products. If we think that that's going to be a clever play as nature faces such stress in the coming decades, for us to be out there on a not being pristine in how we respect our own natural world, try and sell that, try and market that, and it won't work. But also, by going the nature-based solution route, by tackling the biodiversity and pollution crisis as well as the climate crisis, and it is, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said last week, it's a three-way environmental crisis. It's all three have to be addressed in one. So we go low carbon by much more mixed sward grasslands, no fertilizer, no artificial fossil fertilizers. We're not going to have them in a net zero carbon future. So we have to start weaning ourselves off them. That we do set radical standards for the restoration of nature, restoration of biodiversity in our forestry as well as in our farming. That we do start reversing the loss of pristine water quality, and that we start meeting rather than flagrantly ignoring our European ammonia, nitrogen, and other obligations. And in that, we will have a smaller herd, but we get a higher price, and we'll have a secure price for our goods. And we have to make a political decision here. Are we willing to pay our farmers for those services? Are we willing to pay a young generation? We need a young generation now of people to work on our land, to protect and restore nature, to grow beautifully rich natural forests that give long-term supplies of high quality timber and restore nature and water at the same time. And I think the answer to the Irish people from that is going to be yes. And the politics of this matters. Lastly, politics. So we have, John, it's true to say, I think the politics has been good in the last 3 or 4 years in this country because it has been collaborative. The scale of this change will not work if it's a divisive story, if it's a divisive political story, either between left and right, rural and urban, young versus old. We will leave some section of society behind and we won't meet the scale of the ambitions we have. So it has to be an inclusive, consensus-orientated politics. And our Dáil, our Parliament, our Seanad at the moment allows that. We are more in that North European consensus type politics, multi-party coalition politics that actually works for this type of transition in my mind. So that Joint Oireachtas Committee that did good work in the last Dáil did just done some good work on reviewing the climate bill. We will respond to it within the next week or two in the government with our own amendments, with the draft of the bill, go to the Dáil. We will implement it, all going well. And then we set in the next 6 months, putting in place our new climate bill, which builds on the good work that Richard Bruton did in his 2019. It was a very good, ambitious plan, but now we're going further. Now we're really going shooting for the moon on this. And we do it by the sort of changes on less intensive farming, but better paid. Doubling down on our renewables transition, but going further by maybe using that interconnection to export into the rest of Europe in a way that gives us a credit. And then transport, modal shift and reducing demand. That's the way forward in my mind. Thank you. I'm sorry if I spoke for too long.
All right, Minister, you spoke for shorter than I expected. So if you have a few minutes, if I can put a few questions to you that have come in, can I just emphasize the point you make about the collaborative approach in the Oireachtas? having attended parliamentary committees in Ireland and many other countries over decades, the engagement across all parties on this issue is impressive. That this is a serious cross-party issue. First question is from John Sweeney. Given that the national commitment is to reduce emissions by 51% by 2030, can you confirm that Irish negotiators will not accept an effort-sharing reduction less than this, such as 45% in the forthcoming EU Green Deal? Basically, what is your approach to the EU's proposals on upping the ambition, just as we are doing?
I'll be looking to John for advice in that when it comes to it, because it's complicated. God knows it's gone. I see Peter Thorne is on this panel as well. I'd be asking, Maynooth has been one of the great centres of advice and expertise in this. The reason it's complicated because our government commitment was, by nature, it was framed last summer, it had to be based on our latest figures, which related back to 2018, I think it was. So we were setting that goal of 7% a year from there. And whereas the European targets are set for, well, a combination, different targets from 2005 and 1990. And there's all sorts of variations between ETS and non-ETS and so on. So we will be absolutely go into the European process looking to be as ambitious as possible. But our political commitment, that one I have here with my government colleagues, is for that 51% reduction. And it is for us a much more significant ask because if I'm going on memory here now, I think the European Union is currently about 23% below. You know, it's already almost halfway there towards meeting a 55%, well, not quite half, but it's a significant part of the way. Whereas we're starting effectively, you know, it's changed in the last year or two, but with effectively having had no reduction, or we had the target of a 20% reduction on 2020 and we had no reduction. So we have a lot of catching up to do, is the truth. But can I say I'll go into that European Council and indeed the international negotiations by seeking to be as ambitious as we can be and supporting European ambition. And the one thing that encourages me, I'm on 4 European Councils, but I'm on the energy and the environment ones. And both of those, there's a really strong cohort of leadership now, I sense, looking for ambition, more so than in the Commission, which is a sad thing to say, but it's an interesting that the political system, I have a slight sense, just in my own personal contacts, is starting to be more ambitious. And I think that gives me some sense of hope. As well as the Parliament. The Parliament has always been ambitious, but the Council is starting to be.
Another question, when it's basically wind is correlated across northwestern Europe. So when the wind blows here, it blows elsewhere, which means the electricity price in northwestern Europe will be lower. And the question is, why should the Irish consumer pay higher PSO, public service obligation, to export electricity at negative prices? Wouldn't it be better to make green hydrogen? So it's the issue of, yes, we're going to get to 70% at renewables on our system, but I think you have made the point, and many others, that we could actually produce even more electricity than that. Do we pipe it or wire it to Europe, or do we make hydrogen, or where do you see things going in this regard?
We do both. But in truth, the hydrogen, while everyone is now betting on it and investing in it at scale, there's almost a race, there's a hydrogen race, I sense, between Germany, Britain, France, and others as to who's going to be the first to really scale it up. It's still the best use and the best format. I listen to people I respect, and you hear very different views. So I absolutely think hydrogen will be a major part of this, both as a store and as a direct application. You know, I think, go back to what I said about the wind power giving us an industrial future. I think one of the things we would look for the likes of Shannon Estuary or Donegal or other locations is to locate the energy demand close to where the power is. And it could be, rather than having to transfer or transport, like bring the industry here to where the energy is a much better solution. But it will also be electricity integrated markets. I suppose maybe I'm biased. Before I lost my Dáil seat for 5 years, and in that period I worked for a climate diplomacy organisation in London called E3G on the North Sea's Offshore Grid Initiative. And we did a lot of work with Imperial College in London, with Baringa and other organisations looking at what is the economic benefit of when you have an integrated market in this way? I can't remember the exact figures, but it was ridiculously positive. Like it was an 80 billion kind of gain. And the reality is we've probably about 50 or 60, if I recall, excess gigawatts of baseload power in the Northwest market still hanging around. There's huge inefficiencies because of this fragmented electricity market system we have. There's, as long as you trust your neighbors, this is all about trust, that you're going to be able to balance your system. Then, and if you put in the codes and the grid code and mechanisms for the balancing of it, there's huge efficiencies. And if we don't do that integration, the reason I'm so obsessed about integrating the UK into the market as well is, I mean, the UK wholesale electricity prices are 50% above or significantly above continental prices. If we will integrate further and further with the UK, geographically, with the amount of wind we have, we'll have to balance it. We risk, if we don't have the UK integrated, paying very high wholesale prices. So integrating in the Northwest, and in my mind, thinking really big, long-term, integrating a regional Northwest market then with alpine hydro, solar from the south, that really big picture approach is the way we'll get to net zero. And it's a 2050 sort of project, but that's the way it's going. And I think part of that, and that's our time frame, I expect hydrogen, and particularly for Ireland, to have huge potential for fuel, for industry, probably less so for domestic or other, small scale purposes. I think it's more an industrial fuel and storage, and could well be backup for gas-fired power stations, use hydrogen as a store and so on. But that doesn't mean we don't integrate. Everything I've learned over the years is that just as political collaboration works for climate, energy collaboration works for climate. In fact, it doesn't work without collaboration.
There's a very good study done for Scotland on the economics and advantages of hydrogen and where it would be best used, which is worth looking at. One of the concerns in terms of electricity, and it goes back to the question in terms of who pays, that the two electricity interconnectors between Northern Ireland and the Republic and and Great Britain, the consumers in Northern Ireland and in the Republic paid for both of those interconnectors. There was no contribution from the British consumers, whereas the interconnector with France, the EU is paying a large chunk and the French are paying part of it as well. Do you see, you're talking about increased integration into the UK, do you see a change in attitude there where they'd be prepared to pay part of the cost of that interconnection, and get part of the benefit of it?
I think they probably regret they don't own half of that east-west interconnector. That was a very good deal, and we actually got European support for it as well. So it was, and like the European, like God help us, Europe is helping us on the Celtic interconnector. Yeah. I mean, generous or to beat the band. So I'd say the UK probably feel a bit missed. I think they were caught. They got into a bit of ideology on grid, like they really were into kind of merchant connections on transmission connections. I think the scale of this project, the scale of the offshore particularly, there's a natural public interest in public ownership of the transmission networks for this type of infrastructure. In my mind, if you're thinking really big, and this, we're talking 35 gigawatts at least here. So the transmission network for that is beyond. As I said, these are the big engineering challenges of our time, and I think it makes more sense to have a public centralized system. Now, when we start in the Irish Sea, the first connections will be just to shore. It won't be that big kind of long-term planned transmission system. So the first few projects will do that direction connection way, but the long-term development, to my mind, has to be in the basis of a publicly planned and owned transmission system. Can I say that before we do all that, we have one problem, John, and you know this. We have to build the north-south interconnector. I mean, we can all talk big plans and we can all talk. I've been working on that north-south interconnector. I've been looking at it, thinking about it for about 17 years. I remember first, I think in 2003, was it, that the then equivalent of EirGrid, I don't remember what it was called at the time, came and said, we have to have this piece of infrastructure. Like we had a terrible legacy of the Troubles because we were kept on blowing up all our interconnection with the north. And as a result of that, we developed this two-island system, which is very expensive to run, very bad for environmental kind of low emissions. And I know there's huge political challenge around this. People are very concerned about, but it will have to be overground. It is the backbone of our synchronized AC system. It isn't, you know, we will in other places be able to do HVDC, you know, with ship power and whatever, but that's peripheral to our system. This is the core of the system, and up north as well as down south. And if we don't build that, we will have to go towards a two-island. We'll have to separate all the good progress that's been done in the last 10, 20 years of integrating our energy system, and that makes no sense. So that's probably the biggest challenge. One of the biggest challenges in my desk is how in the next 6 months do we get over the real political challenge of going ahead with a project that's very unpopular in the local area. I know that, but it is, we need it. We need that first step.
Having held it up down here, I think that the blockage now is in Northern Ireland, and for Northern Ireland, they've kept a clapped out coal-fired power station going over the last decade, which should have closed over a decade ago, because they need it, because in the absence of the interconnector. So I think the point you make is really important.
It's subject to judicial review, I think, up north. But if we don't proceed in some sort of timely fashion, they'll have to replace those power stations with new, probably fossil fuel stations that are a more spinning reserve, that baseload spinning reserve for the next 30 years, that makes low carbon really difficult. It's a technical issue, but unfortunately, it's very important.
All right, Minister, I think we'd better let you go. Thank you for your time. As always, you bring an enthusiasm to the area. This is not a problem. This is an opportunity, is normally your line. So thank you very much. And we look forward to your successful work in the future.
Thank you very much indeed.
And the first panel will begin in about 10 minutes, chaired by Marie Donnelly.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to panel 1 of the RIA conference on achieving Ireland's climate action ambitions. We have a really interesting lineup for this session, where we will be looking at the policy outlook with 3 speakers, Brian Carroll, Peter Thorne and Kerrie Sheehan. So without taking any further time, because we have a lot of issues to discuss in this area, I'm going to go straight into the speakers and introduce our first speaker, who is Brian Carroll. Hardly needs any introduction, Brian. You're well known as the Assistant Secretary responsible for climate action and environment in the department. I think everybody here knows you very well, knows your track record, not only in Ireland, but also at a European Union level, because you have responsibilities in that context as well. Brian, I'm going to hand you the floor and let you take over with your slide presentation.
Thanks very much, Marie, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk this morning about Ireland's climate action plans, the 2019 plan, the preparation we're doing for the 2021 one, and a look beyond that. In terms of an overview of what I'm going to say, I'll talk first about changing contexts and ambitions, then focus in around some of the specifics of the 2019 plan. I'll move on then and talk about governance and the Climate Action Plan Amendment Bill 2020, which we'll be hoping to have in the Oireachtas in the near future. Then look at the Climate Action Plan 2021 and finish by talking a little bit around the importance of engaging citizens and communities in the transition. Starting with the 2019 plan and the context in which it was produced. In 2018, we had the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, and it pointed out that we had limited time to act globally. It said 12 years, I think, at the time, before we'd lock in the irreversible and catastrophic consequences of climate change. So it really pointed up the urgence of actions. Around that time as well, the Citizens' Assembly was meeting in Ireland and had a couple of weekends where it focused in on climate and how climate should be addressed in Ireland. And the report of the Citizens' Assembly, which was also produced in 2018, set out the ambition that Ireland should become a leader in climate change, as against a perception that we were a laggard in terms of action. That report was taken up by the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action, which published in 2019, and it took on the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly and then in turn produced its own set of recommendations to inform government. And in that year also, we had the declaration in the Dáil of both climate and biodiversity emergencies. And one other piece of the context, and the Minister alluded to it earlier, is our performance against targets. And I know there's a presentation on that coming shortly. And certainly in terms of emissions, we're well adrift of where we need to be in terms of reducing them. Our 2020 target at EU level was for a 20% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. We're likely to end up somewhere between a 2 and 4% reduction. So that's between 16 and 18 percentage points short of the target that we committed to. So clearly there is a challenge around implementation and realising climate ambition in Ireland. So the key features of the 2019 plan when it was published in June of 2019, was it identified for the first time how Ireland would achieve its 2030 targets for carbon emissions and put us on a trajectory to net zero by 2050. And that's important. This was the first time we had a plan, and I come back to this implementation piece, if fully implemented, would get us to a minus 30% target in our non-ETS for 2030. Of course, that target will be subject to revision in the near future, and the programme for government has also brought forward additional ambition. The plan also set out, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, strong governance and the importance of enshrining that in law. It pointed to the need for effective citizen involvement, to engage them and empower citizens to take the decisions we need them to take, and of course aim to deliver a better, healthier and more resilient future for the country. And that resilience isn't simply environmental resilience, it's also an economic resilience. At the moment, the fossil fuel economic model, which since we started burning them during the Industrial Revolution and has created great wealth, income and employment, is essentially redundant. And we have taken a decision that in the next 30 years, we're going to remove fossil fuels from our economic model. So that also is an important economic as well as environmental transformation that has to be undertaken. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide. The piece of analysis that informed the Climate Action Plan was a marginal abatement cost curve. We commissioned McKinsey to prepare it for us, and I'm sure most people listening this morning are very familiar with these curves. The width of each column represents the abatement opportunity, and the vertical length, the cost. If something is below the horizontal, it suggests a net benefit to society based on total cost of ownership. If it's above, it suggests a cost. And in terms of, I don't know if it's visible, but there's a red dotted line on the right-hand side, a vertical red dotted line. That's how far we would have had to go to in terms of the 2019 plan to hit our EU non-ETS 30% target. And the very heartening thing about this is the options we have to take, the bulk of them are either on the line or below the line, suggesting over the lifetime of the investment compared to its best alternative fossil fuel option, it delivers a net benefit to society. So that's the analysis that informed the 2019 Climate Action Plan. To give a flavour of the measures that were identified across the various sectors and the scale of emissions reductions, I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but you can see electricity, a 50 to 55% reduction, transport 40 to 50%, built environment 40 to 45%, and greenhouse gases, and so on down. And some of the big, I suppose, commitments, electricity moving to generating from renewable sources, 70% of our needs by 2030. That is a significant increase from where we were in 2020, where we committed to 40% renewable electricity by 2020, up to 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. The Minister alluded earlier to upgrading 500,000 homes to a BER B2, and the huge challenge we face in ramping up from about 2,000 a year on average now to 50,000 a year if we were to hit that target over a decade. The installation of 600,000 heat pumps, 200,000 of them are in new builds, but 400,000 in existing homes, and increased use of alternative fuels in industry, for example, waste for cement production, and in agriculture, increasing farm efficiency in line with the Teagasc marginal abatement cost curve, and also expanding the carbon sink opportunities represented by LULUCF. In terms of governance, the plan in 2019, and much of this now is taken up in the climate bill, which finished pre-legislative scrutiny late last year. Firstly, the government will be updating the Climate Action Plan on an annual basis. There's a fairly stringent oversight, a Climate Action Delivery Board, which is chaired by the Secretary General of the Department of the Taoiseach and the Secretary General of the department I work in. Quarterly reporting on actions. That quarterly report goes to government and is published, so there's transparency. A new role envisaged for the Climate Change Advisory Council in proposing carbon budgets, a role for the Oireachtas in holding ministers accountable, in particular in relation to sectoral carbon budgets which are to be introduced. And the plan envisaged that many of these aspects of governance would be brought forward in a climate action amendment bill, and that is the bill that we are currently working on. So now I would like to focus in on the bill itself and key features of it. Firstly, and I've mentioned this already, our national target is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And that target is going to be enshrined in legislation in the bill. The bill will also provide for, as I said, annual updates of climate action plans, but also the production every 5 years of long-term climate action strategies, which will have an outlook to 2050 and beyond. Carbon budgets is probably the big innovation in the bill. The Climate Change Advisory Council are going to propose a series of economy-wide 5-year carbon budgets, and they'll be proposed in a programme of 3. The first 2 will be fully committed to and can only be changed under very particular circumstances related to climate science or changing international or European obligations. The third of the series will be on a provisional basis, but in due course, when it becomes part of the second series, will be firmed up. The government on the carbon budgets will the minister in the first instance will have to accept the recommendation or explain it. There'll be a process set out in the bill whereby over between 2-4 months, depending on a series of points, that the budgets will come to be approved by the Oireachtas and or the government. In circumstances where Oireachtas approval can't be got, there's a provision that the government can subsequently look at the budgets and approve them. But a key feature will be, and it'll be the responsibility of the minister to propose, is the sectoral division of the economy-wide carbon budget. So each sectoral minister will become responsible to ensuring emissions in their sectors remain below a ceiling. And having worked in the climate area now for nearly 5 years, one of the great challenges is pushing a horizontal agenda across sectors that have the levers where they have legitimate competing objectives. And by shifting to sectoral carbon budgets that are legally binding, you are mainstreaming a climate objective into sectors that would not necessarily have had climate as one of their primary objectives. So that is a very significant change in terms of driving forward climate action. So quickly, in terms of the Climate Action Plan 2021, its objective is to give effect to the step up in ambition in the programme for government and to continue to drive implementation. I think I may have unwittingly skipped one slide. So the step up in ambition in the Climate Action Plan, or in the programme for government for the next Climate Action Plan, is a 7% reduction per annum in carbon emissions over the decade, or 51% in total, and that net zero ambition by 2050. It's double the ambition in the 2019 Climate Action Plan. The 2019 Climate Action Plan averages out at about 3.5% reduction in emissions over the decade. So we're talking about doubling that. And we had a look at some of the sort of measures that were necessary to deliver the 2019 one. So you're talking about doubling that ambition. So it's a very, very significant step up. Analytical work is underway at the moment, and we're engaging with departments and state bodies with a view to having the plan completed by June of this year. And we're shortly going to be launching a public consultation and a call for expert evidence. That'll happen in very early March. The last piece I wanted to mention then is around citizens and communities. And again, the programme for government recognises the scale of this transformation involves a whole of government, whole of society effort, and citizens and communities really need to be engaged, informed, and empowered to act. Even taking some of the numbers in the Climate Action Plan 2019, 500,000 retrofits, 400,000 EV or 400,000 heat pumps in existing houses, 1 million EVs, you're already up to 1.9 million decisions that you need somebody to make. And how do you get people and support them and empower them to make those decisions? So 3 pillars in terms of citizen and community engagement. One is around strategic communications and ensuring that government communicates coherently and consistently to society. The second is around local dialogue leading to action, and a central role for local authorities in that, so that at a local level, people can talk and decide what they want to do, and we bring forward policies and supports to enable them to do it. And the third piece is a national forum akin to the NED. If we have these, the NED is the National Economic Dialogue, if we have these local discussions happening and people trying to achieve climate action, that there is a national forum where all the relevant representative bodies can meet a number of times a year as a good feedback loop into policy making and future iterations of climate action plan. So I'm just saying 5 seconds over my time. My concluding remarks: very significant step up in climate ambition envisaged. The Climate Action Bill will put strong governance structures in place, really, really important in terms of mainstreaming climate as an obligation in sectors that have the levers to make the change. The next plan will be built around the commitments in the programme for government, and in doing that we'll ensure very strong engagement with citizens and communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian, and not a problem. Thank you very much indeed, Brian. No problem, you were almost exactly on time, and I have to say that what you were telling us was extremely interesting, and I think you'll find that there'll be a lot of questions coming back afterwards on some of the issues that you raised there. Perhaps we can move to our next speaker now, who is Professor Peter Thorne. Peter is the director of Icarus Climate Research Centre at Maynooth University. He's also extremely active and very involved in the IPCC Working Group 1. He's a coordinating lead author for the 6th assessment report, which is due later this year, and is a member of the co-writing team for the synthesis report that will come in 2022. In addition to this, he's very active in the area of global climate observation systems and indeed in the Horizon 2020 research programme out of the European Union. Peter, of course, has international experience, having worked previously in Norway, amongst other areas where he has been working. So I don't think I need to give much more of an introduction there, Peter. If you're ready with your slides, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, hopefully that's now working. Sorry, it was all good. Okay, so I'm going to talk on the latest IPCC special reports. I'm afraid I can't give spoilers on the upcoming reports. They're pre-decisional documents, but we have been very busy in the 6th assessment report cycle. For the first time ever, there are 3 special reports. So we already had a job of work before we had an issue then over this minor issue called COVID. So there are 3 special reports that I will talk to. So the first is the special report on land. And if you want the headline, land is where we live. Land is undergoing human pressure irrespective of human influence upon climate. Land is also a part of the solution, but land can't do it all. So land is a critical resource. We rely on it for food, water, health, and well-being, but it is undergoing human pressure already. And climate change, as in many other aspects, is a force multiplier, a pressure multiplier upon an already stressed system. The land that we are already using, we're not using it all, but we're using most of it, could feed the world in a changing climate and provide biomass for renewable energy. But to do that would require early, far-reaching action across several fronts. We're not in the territory here of tinkering with land use if we're going to make full use of it for addressing the climate challenge. We need wholesale change in land use. Coordinated action to tackle climate change can also simultaneously improve land, food security and nutrition, and help to end hunger. So the solutions are fundamentally out there. And better land management can play its part in tackling climate change, but it can't do it all. So it's not all the fault of agriculture. We need to do the other things that we're talking about in this session and in this workshop today. It needs to be an all-of-economy approach. So that's the special report on climate change and land in a nutshell. There's a lot more in that report that is of huge interest, but that's, at the bottom line, those are the key themes coming out of that. So moving on to the next special report, which is in the oceans and the cryosphere in a changing climate. What's really key to understand here is that the oceans and the cryosphere are the long-term integrators of the climate system. They've been taking the heat from climate change for decades. In excess of 97% of the total energy imbalance has gone between them to the oceans and the cryosphere. And the consequences of this for nature and for humanity are sweeping and severe. I'll concentrate just upon the one that's probably of most relevance to Ireland in a national context, which is sea level rise and coastal extremes. We are an island. Most of our big cities are at or very close to sea level. During the 20th century, the global mean sea level rose by about 15 centimeters. But it's currently rising more than twice as fast as that. And it will further accelerate, and it could reach up to 1.1 meter in 2100 if emissions are not sharply reduced. But it's not just mean sea level, it's extreme sea levels. And we've seen that in Cork. We've had flooding in Cork. We've had near misses, to be frank, in Dublin. We've had high sea level surges come at low tide or in a neap tide. We have not had the catastrophic spring tide plus storm surge plus sea level combination, but it's only a matter of time until we might get such an occurrence. They now occur much more commonly. Many low-lying coastal cities and small islands will be exposed to the risks of flooding and land loss annually by 2050, especially without strong adaptation. But we can only engineer so far. To date, the ocean has taken up more than 90% of that excess heat in the climate system. It will take up again 2 to 4 times more heat again by the end of this century if global warming is limited to 2 degrees centigrade, and up to 5 to 7 times as much in a higher emissions scenario. That warming reduces mixing between water layers and therefore the supply of oxygen and nutrients for marine life. So there is a real risk of a cascading ecosystem collapse. Marine heat waves are becoming more frequent and severe, killing corals, kelp forests, and other marine life. And the ocean take-up of human-induced carbon emissions is making the ocean more acidic. And that's really problematic because the skeletons of many of the marine organisms and shells of marine organisms are fundamentally a function of carbonate chemistry. We're changing that chemistry. So the more decisively and earlier we act, the more able we will be to address unavoidable changes, manage risks, improve our lives, and achieve sustainability for ecosystems and people around the world, today and in the future. So the bottom line from the special report on oceans and cryosphere is that the oceans and the cryosphere sustain us. I didn't touch on things like glaciers in the Himalayas, which feed the great rivers that feed billions of people. When the glaciers disappear, the seasonality of that stream flow will fundamentally change. So the ocean and cryosphere sustain us, they're under pressure, their changes affect all our lives, and the time for action is fundamentally now. So moving it on to the special report on 1.5, the first special report, the special report was mentioned in the prior talk. Where are we now? Well, this is now in 2018. So at the time, we thought that since pre-industrial times, human activities have caused approximately 1 degree of global warming. If you fast forward to today, that's closer to 1.1 degree of global warming. We are already seeing the consequences of that warming for people, nature, and livelihoods. Climate change is not a future problem. Climate change is a clear present issue for many, many people. If we continue warming at the current rate, we would reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. So that's a linear extrapolation. That's not taking into account how we might change or bend that curve in either direction. And importantly, past emissions alone do not commit us to a 1.5 degrees world. It is not fundamentally too late to move us away from, keep us below 1.5 degrees. What would we gain if we did that? What would the impacts be on us at 1.5 compared to 2 degrees? Well, the first thing is there would be less extreme weather where people live, including extreme heat and rainfall. And we have already seen in Ireland in recent years examples of extreme heat and rainfall that have been made more likely by human influence. That doesn't mean they could not have occurred without our influence, but we have loaded the dice. We have made such events more likely already. This is that clear and present issue of climate change, not a future problem. By 2100, global mean sea level rise would be around 10 centimeters lower if we kept it below 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. But it's important to note that the cryosphere in particular, but also the oceans, as was noted in the prior set of slides on the ocean report, is a very long integrator. It will take centuries to millennia for sea level to equilibrate with our current historical emissions to date. And 10 million fewer people would be exposed to the risk of those rising seas. So how do we get there? What are the greenhouse gas emission pathways that the special report on 1.5 argued was consistent with that pathway? So to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, carbon dioxide emissions would have to fall by about 45% from 2030, by 2030 from the 2010 levels. Whereas if we wanted to keep it, if we limited our ambition to 2 degrees, we would only need to reduce it by 25%. Now, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, again, CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero around 2050. And again, if we were less ambitious, 2070 for 2 degrees centigrade. Reducing the non-CO2 emissions would have distinct and immediate health benefits in addition. So I'm going to spend my remaining time talking to you around a totemic figure from the report, the first figure in the SPM. And this is how it's going to start. And we're going to start by looking just on the left-hand side here at the two curves. There's a grey curve, which is very wiggly, which is the observed changes. That's a combination of the response to anthropogenic human forcing, CO2 and other things, and natural variability. And then in the orange, in the shaded, is the estimate of the forced only component of that, the component that arises solely from our historical emissions. You can see they match, and you can see we're at about 1 degrees in about 2017 when this report was provided. Now we can look at the emissions of various things. There is in here, there is stylized net global CO2 emission pathway in panel B, the cumulative net CO2 emissions in panel C in billions of tons, and then this panel D, which is non-CO2 but radiative forcing. So these are all the other things, your methane, your synthetic gases, CFCs, other things that are going on. So if we take that, and hopefully I haven't now, okay, good. Okay, so you can take that, and if you follow those pathways for those CO2 emissions and the non-CO2 pathways, you get this grey banded, which is the estimate of what the climate how the climate system would respond. And you can see that with limited overshoot, we can keep it well below 2 degrees, with probably the mean climate staying below 1.5 degrees. What if we wanted to increase our ambitions? So if instead of going for 2050 for net zero or 2055 for net zero, we increased our ambition to 2040. So if we were really ambitious, what would happen next? So this is the, hopefully, the ambition. Yeah, there's the ambition that's coming in, that reducing it to 2040. And this is what you would do to the curve. Instead of having the grey curve, you would have the blue curve. Okay, great. What if, and this is the playing with the what ifs, what if instead we said concentrated solely upon CO2 and forgot about methane and forgot about the other greenhouse gases? Well, you end up with a flattening of that non-CO2 greenhouse gas forcing that's higher, and you commensurately end up warmer again than you would have done otherwise. And the fundamental take home here is that every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice we make matters. We cannot have special pleading. If we are to keep below 1.5 degrees, every single sector needs to play a hugely aggressive part in getting us to and keeping us below the 1.5 degree target. So no special pleading, we all need to act. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for that. And indeed, I was particularly impressed with how your graphs changed towards the end. Can I just remind everybody that you can send in questions on the app. We're collecting them at the moment, and we will take them when the presentations have finished. Our next speaker is Kerrie Sheehan, who is Head of Research and Technology at SEAI. And Kerrie has responsibility for research and innovation, offshore energy, electricity and wind. And the list is very long, Kerrie. I don't know how you managed to get a weekend off at all. Impressive, I have to say. Previously, Kerrie was with UCD, and she will take us through now in terms of what is the current progress on Ireland's climate targets. The floor is yours, Kerrie.
Okay, many thanks, and thanks for having me here. So my role here today is to provide the current progress towards Ireland's targets as described by Brian and Peter before me. Okay, so we'll look at a kind of a quick recap of the 2030 targets, and then we'll look how Ireland is set to achieve these by the end of 2020, and then we look at the individual targets that make that up. And finally, I'll describe measures being undertaken by SEAI to get to where we need to go to. So the key 3 EU targets for 2030 are to increase by 32% of final consumption from renewable energy, to increase by 32.5% improvement in energy efficiency against the baseline of 2007. And initially it was to cut greenhouse gases by 40% by 1990 levels. However, the 2019 Green Deal strives for Europe to be climate neutral by 2050, with an interim target of reducing greenhouse gases by at least 55% by 2030. So, as Frans Timmermans has stated in relation to post-COVID 2019, green recovery is not only possible, but crucial to invest in green and sustainable economy restoration. So the Irish targets, I've gone on ahead. So the Irish targets have been transposed into Irish legislation by Ireland's National Energy and Climate Plan, which outlines the renewable energy and energy efficiency contributions. And these are now binding. And Ireland is projected to meet the emissions target over the period 2021 to 2030, subject to full implementation of the Climate Action Plan, which has been increased to 51%, as discussed earlier, from 30%, reflecting the programme for government. So what happens if we miss the binding targets? Well, monetary fines for compliance costs, potential reputational damage, and progressively harder to catch up. The programme for government provides for 7% reduction in emissions each year, but that's cumulative. So if we fall short one year, we'll have to make it up in future years. And of course, further damage to the climate. So the state of play in 2020, the 3 main targets, we're looking at renewable energy, energy efficiency, and the non-ETS emissions. So the interim targets are to increase renewable energy by 16%, increase energy efficiency by 20%, and reduce on the non-ETS emissions by 20%. Now, renewable energy is made up of, there's 3 components that make up the renewable energy. Electricity is to get their source from renewable energy by 40%, heat 12%, and transport 10%. So the early numbers on this coming in, the 2020 figures are being currently analysed, but this is the early indicators. So we can see that we are slightly missing the renewable energy target, predominantly to do with heat, and we'll discuss that further now in a while. Energy efficiency, we're also falling slightly short, and that's really, we need to do more quickly. The non-ETS is at 4%. However, if we do implement the Climate Action Plan, we will reach that by 2030. Oh, okay. Oh, apologies. So we look at the renewable energy targets in more detail. So overall, at the end of 2019, we were at 12% of the 16 targets. And so this is a 1% increase, and we're looking at probably getting up to 13 to 14% by the end of 2020. This, up to the end of 2019, this avoided 5.8 million tonnes of CO2 emissions and over 500 million of fossil fuel imports. So onto transport. The expectation is that we'll be between 9 and 10% renewables when the 2020 figures are final. The biofuel obligation scheme has contributed significantly, and with a very small contribution to date coming from electric vehicles. As electrification of transport ramps up, the quicker the emissions can be addressed. So heat is what people use in their homes and also industry processes, heat and services. Residential accounts for most of the sector. Progress to date has been achieved by moving away from oil and utilising biomass. There was no overall change in achieving the targets from 2018 to 2019. This is the sector we need to take action on. While recent strong growth in heat pumps due to domestic building regulation changes have grown, but there's been limited effect to the 2020 contribution. Ireland is currently in the bottom 2 countries in heat, so there's a lot more to do in this area. So electricity is the success story of the renewable energy source. This is as a result of significant stakeholder alignment, strong and targeted policy package that led to a very strong renewable energy and decarbonisation trajectory for electricity. The share of electricity generated from renewable source increased by 3.2% to 36.5% in 2019. And it is on trajectory to achieve the 40% by the end of 2020. So we can see now the ambition to get from where we are now to 2013 is definitely a need for accelerated action. And this will likely get steeper when the actions required to deliver on the 2013 EU targets are incorporated and new actions in line with the programme for government are put in place. In relation to energy efficiency, it does continue to be a national imperative with a crucial role to play in Ireland, meeting its national and international energy and climate goals and objectives. Ireland has achieved approximately 14% of the 2020 target against 20%. This has been made up of home upgrades, high BUR rated new builds, business and public sector energy efficiency measures. Significant scaling is required across all the sectors to achieve the 2030 target of 32.5%. As shown on the graphs, there is significant action required to meet the Climate Action Plan retrofit targets. As discussed previously by Brian, that 500,000 additional homes are to be retrofitted to B or B2 standard by 2030. Just to put this in context, approximately 4,000 were delivered in 2020. Again, heat pumps, we can see on the lower graph, the target is 600,000 heat pumps installed by 2030. Again, in context, 8,000 were delivered in 2020. So there is a lot to do here, but the plan is in place, and this is also further supported by greater focus on energy carbon ratings when selling property. In relation to emissions, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels used for energy fell by 4.5% in 2019. This marked the biggest yearly reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions since 2011 at the height of the last recession. In contrast, in 2019, the economy grew by 3.2%. So we're seeing a decoupling effect. We also saw a further fall in 2020 of around 6%. However, this is largely due to COVID-19 mitigating efforts, which impacted significantly on transport. But reductions that will possibly undone when we come out of the pandemic-related restrictions. On the face of it, the pre-COVID reductions are a sign of real progress. But as we saw, most of the progress was in eliminating fossil fuels and increasing renewables and electricity generation, with little progress in heat and transport. And Ireland is projected to meet the emissions targets over the 2021-30, subject to, again, implementation of the Climate Action Plan. Though we will need an intensification of strong energy needs from renewable sources, obtaining energy efficiency and modal shift. And it is encouraged to see the recent investment in cycle lanes. So, in line with stepped up activity across SEAI delivering programs towards reaching the targets, the Research and Technology Department is busy investigating solutions and gaps towards realising Ireland's ambitions. So the first example I'm going to show you is in the priority area of heat. It's accounting for nearly 40%, heat accounts for nearly 40% of final energy use in Ireland. And this in-depth, comprehensive study will analyse the options for heat decarbonisation out to 2050. It will consider relevant studies and research in the space and involve significant stakeholder engagement. It will provide a detailed evidence base, including technology and policy pathways, and provide data and insights for government, industry, and other stakeholders. These further details are on our website. Another project underway is doing further work to identify technologies and supply chains towards decarbonising Ireland's energy system. Multiple stakeholders across policymakers and Enterprise Ireland. By undertaking this particular study, SEAI wishes to identify the most impactful technologies to achieve decarbonisation of Ireland's energy system by 2050, identify gaps to accelerate the development and implementation of these technologies to the required regulation standards, laws and directives, and identify research and innovation needs to realise full potential of national policies. Offshore is an ongoing work programme in this department in SEAI, and SEAI supports the Irish offshore energy sector by advising government on policy, offering grant support schemes, developing test site infrastructure and EU collaborations. Okay. And finally, I want to mention the SEAI National Energy Research Development and Demonstration Funding Programme, which invests in innovative RD&D projects which contribute to Ireland's transition to a clean and secure energy future. The overarching objectives of the SEAI National RD&D Programme are to accelerate the Irish development and deployment of competitive energy projects, processes and systems, support solutions that enable technical and other barriers to energy market uptake, grow Ireland's national capacity to develop international class energy or D&D, and provide guidance and support to policymakers through results, outcomes, and learning from supported projects. More than 100 projects have been successful under previous calls, and as a result, many companies and academic institutions are leading innovative projects and collaborations in the area of wind energy, bioenergy, energy systems integration, energy efficiency, energy markets, smart grids, transportation, energy policy, and community engagement. I am delighted to let you know that last week SEAI launched a new round of government funding for energy research and innovation. This call includes co-funding with the Department of Transport and GSI, or Geological Survey of Ireland. It is open to companies, research organisations, semi-state and public bodies, either individually or as part of a consortium. The call includes topics which reflect the Climate Action Plan and Programme for Government priorities, and also an open strand where applicants can pitch their research proposals. So the deadline is the 29th of March, 2021. And there is actually a webinar this morning, but it will be available on our webpage for information on how to apply. Well, thank you very much. And to wrap up, the key message is that full implementation of the Climate Action Plan will mean Ireland delivers or achieves our targets, but it will require action from each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kerrie. That was excellent and very informative, if a little bit daunting in terms of the gaps that we have to close over the next little while. Just to remind everybody, you can post questions. We have a number of questions. I'm not going to go straight into them now, but you can continue to post questions if you wish. We have a number of comments in about the bill and whether our target, in fact, at net zero is a fair target. Does it reflect Ireland's responsibility in the global world? And I suppose the other side of that coin is, does it represent a fair obligation on the population of Ireland? Well, a general question. Maybe I could start with you, Brian, please.
Thanks, Marie. The net zero was the commitment made in the programme for government, and my understanding is it was derived from climate science and what it was considered appropriate for Ireland to do in terms of the challenge we're facing. Now, there are two pieces that the bill is going to call out in terms of consideration about how we address achieving net zero. And one is climate justice and looking at that global piece and the decisions we make about how we decide to decarbonise and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and do it in a way that's conscious of the wider global implications of decisions made. And the second is around the just transition, which I suppose is bringing that focus of climate justice down to a national level. We've had one example already, I suppose, of the just transition in Ireland, and this is the moving out of the generation of electricity from peat and government came forward with a national just transition fund, and actually Bord na Móna have announced relatively recently their new brown to green strategy, how they're going to become a climate and environment solutions company, and in particular rehabilitating 33,000 hectares of bogland, which will have very significant climate benefits and also biodiversity benefits. So I think it's a fair question, and that issue of equity and justice needs to be managed globally as well as nationally. But in particular, looking at the national piece, it's important to recognise that decarbonising brings new types of jobs opportunities and new types of industry, whether it's people transitioning from cutting turf to restoring bogs, or building onshore and offshore wind in due course. And in my presentation, I did mention the importance of embracing the economic transition, because if we don't embrace it, I think we'll be left behind with an economic model that isn't fit for purpose.
Thanks, Brian. Peter, I'm sure you have a view on that as well, given your background and knowledge.
Yes, so I mean, fundamentally, physics doesn't care for special pleading. If we're going to keep it to 1.5, absolutely everyone needs to get to net zero by 2050. The politics aspect is around just transitions, as Brian mentioned. But also, I think we need to flip this on its head a little bit and look at the benefits to Ireland of being a leader. That's what the Citizens' Assembly was strong on. There are many opportunities and advantages to being a first mover, potentially, many export opportunities, many opportunities to society. So we need to shed our laggard label, become the leader, embrace this. There are many, many benefits to getting to net zero, and we need to embrace them and realise those benefits. And we realise those by being a leader, not a laggard.
Thank you. Kerrie, I wonder, could I pass another question to you, please? How and where do you see bioenergy playing a role in the transition here in Ireland? And it really comes in two parts, in terms of, say, residential heat, and of course also industrial heat.
I think we need to build our regulation around this area, and there's certainly opportunity to grow. It has made a large impact in transport already, and we may be at saturation at that point, but there's certainly that's an element coming out of the heat study of where it can be harnessed, and it'll be it definitely does have a place, and we just need to build a framework and policies around that and deliver.
Just on the question here, the comment was made that, you know, if you take the residential sector, for example, I don't suppose fundamentally people object to the notion of having more comfortable, warmer homes at a cheaper cost. But there seems to be a number of obstacles in the way. You know, what are the technologies we can use? Have we enough skills? Are people really aware and supported in making the choices? And of course, what about the cash, the funding to support this kind of change?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunity to look at the financing aspect, and the technologies are being developed, and also part of that technologies mapping exercise, we're looking at the skills gap there, and working with the enterprise agencies to look about a kind of the FDI and our homegrown, and what is needed to do, and also I guess we have to look at education coming through, and it's like security of supply by growing our own in this area as well, of course. There is definitely, to get to where we need to get Two, there are barriers, but we're hoping with each better through funding schemes to overcome these and also to raise awareness widely and upskill. Hopefully we can get there.
Excellent. Could I ask maybe Brian, and Peter referred to this in his presentation about the fact that we all need to do now, because every day counts, every month counts, every year counts. You will be looking at sectoral budgets going forward, and you are inevitably going to be confronted with special pleading to be expected. What are you going to do if one or other sector says, we just can't do it, or we don't want to do it?
I suppose the first thing that we are doing at the moment is forming a sectoral perspective, a cross-sectoral perspective on what the distribution of effort should be. Now, as we're preparing the Climate Action Plan 2021, what we need to do is put all options on the table. Some are known, settled technologies and solutions. Others are technologies that may be for the future, but there's clearly an opportunity there. And there are probably bits that we don't know yet. But I think the first step is to put all options on the table and to see, firstly, maybe through the lens of what is the most cost-effective or efficient way to do this on an economy-wide basis. But then, obviously, there are many other considerations that need to be overlaid on that in terms of social, political, fairness, and so on. But the commitment is there to do it. Once the bill, the political commitment in the programme for government, when the bill is enacted, it will be a legal requirement that we achieve the net zero by 2050, and that the carbon budgets proposed in the first instance by the Climate Change Advisory Council on an economy-wide basis and then divided up on a sectoral basis on the recommendation of the Minister to Government will be complied with. So, of course, there will be special pleading and there will be challenges, but ultimately, it'll be a matter for government to decide on the sectoral division of the budgets, and then they will be legal obligations on the relevant minister to ensure that they bring forward the policies and measures. But I think to go back to what Peter said about embracing the opportunity, I think that's a really important perspective to have. But I don't underestimate the challenge in ramping up to the level of activity that's required across all sectors from where we are today.
I think you're right on that one. Peter, actually, could I come back to you, because you started by pointing out how important and valuable and useful ultimately land is. And we consider Ireland to be, we have a bountiful supply of land. How do you see land contributing to this challenge that we face?
So we have enormous opportunities in Ireland with land, but we have to recognise that for the past 2 centuries, we have fundamentally desecrated our land. 2 centuries ago, we had lots of peat bogs that are multi-century stores of carbon. Not only are they multi-century stores of carbon, they are fundamentally rich in biodiversity. They store water when it rains too much. They release water when it rains too little. We have a fundamental opportunity to reimagine our land. One thing that has surprised me is that we do not have a national land use plan. We need a national land use plan as a matter of urgency. And then we need to work with the landowners to put in place appropriate land management structures. We need to diversify away from our agricultural model as it is, but we absolutely need to bring the farmers with us in doing so. It cannot be something where you say you must kill 25% of your cattle tomorrow. There must be reasonable alternatives. We must carry communities with us. But I would hope that we could see a more diverse rural quilt of land use. It would be a more friendly to wildlife, a more happy place to live. Potentially, it would also be diversified away from current monoculture or effectively monoculture, which is anyway economically advisable. So there are many reasons that we should, but we have enormous opportunities to undo 2 centuries of desecration and to really store a lot of carbon with many, many benefits.
Excellent, thank you very much. Kerrie, I know that SEAI is supporting the purchase of electric vehicles. It's a big part of the existing climate action plan, but it's becoming very a la mode now to talk about supply chain security. And of course, the battery is a fundamental element of the car, as indeed are semiconductors. So do we have plans for a closed loop on the batteries of electric vehicles? And what are we going to do? I just saw a recent article in the Financial Times. You know, semiconductors come primarily from South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And it's now one of the ones that President Biden has put on his security of supply list as of yesterday. And I suspect we might have similar concerns, not just in Ireland, but indeed in Europe. So to what extent are we looking at these elements around the actions foreseen in the Climate Action Plan?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. It's a good question, and probably one I wouldn't do justice to our EV department. I can certainly get them to do a note on that, but certainly I would imagine it's coming from an EU level, from the security of supply perspective for Ireland in this case. But yeah, I think I'll not go too far on that one.
No problem at all. Brian, would you have any comment on that?
Well, I suppose a couple of things, Mary. One is that I think there's an onus on us to actively try and manage the supply chain and to engage with producers and suppliers. I mean, one advantage to being small is that you only need to capture a small proportion of the supply to ensure you have what you need. So that's one bit of it. And I think more broadly, I mean, the shift to EVs is one part of the solution. And I mean, I suppose looking forward to the 2021 Climate Action Plan, part of what we need to be thinking about is in the next 10, 20 years, what is transport going to look like in our 5 cities? What role is public transport going to play? Looking at the commitments in the programme for government to active mobility, cycling, walking, and I suppose a vision for livable cities where we reduce the reliance on cars into the future. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of managing the supply chain and dealing with it to try and secure what we need, but also particularly in our cities where there are clearly other alternatives that can be viable, to really start pushing on those then and reduce our need, our reliance on cars.
I think the whole question of urban living is going to be one of the ones dealt with in the next session. Donna Gartland will be talking about a new way of heating our buildings, which I think is very interesting. Peter, I wonder, could I ask you about your view of the role and the importance of adaptation in the new Climate Action Plan for 2021?
So yes, so I mean, quite rightly perhaps, we've been worried about the mitigation side. So mitigation is how we reduce emissions. Adaptation is recognizing that we already live in a changed climate. Indeed, our climate has changed more in the last century than it has in the last several thousand years. And if we look back in geological terms into the long-term history, civilization has developed in what is remarkably quiet and quiescent climate period, remarkably stable climate. We've built all our infrastructure, everything, relative to a very stable climate, and now we're deliberately turning the thermostat up. People talk about geoengineering. Well, we've been geoengineering for 150, 250 years. We've got to stop geoengineering. But we've got to recognize that we do live in that changed world. we've got to recognise that things like the flooding in Cork that happened this winter will become more prevalent in the future, irrespective of how well we mitigate, because of those very long components of the climate system that I talked about in my talk. The ocean, and in particular the great ice sheets, will take thousands of years to catch up with what we've done to the climate system in the last 150 years. So adaptation is a huge part. We need to be climate smart, climate resilient. That means that we need effective adaptation plans. We need effective planning. We need to recognize where and when we can do things, particularly if we're talking infrastructure that we're building for 100 years. We need to be aware that the 100 years time, it will be in a different climate. And that different climate means that you might be able to put something here today, but it would not be safe in 100 years time. So don't put it here today, because you're baking in stranded assets, decisions that are bad. We need to do a lot more on adaptation than we have. We need a far more effective national adaptation plan, and that needs to be cascaded to practitioners very effectively, so that we can avoid making expensive mistakes that cost infrastructure, that cost lives in the end, potentially. So we need to do a lot better on adaptation. We need to recognize that it's not just the mitigation side of the coin we need to attend to, but we also need to attend to the adaptation side of the coin.
Well, I can see that some interaction with our board Planala and planning departments might be relevant in that context. It's one of the, as you know, one of the most sensitive issues that we can think of. Maybe I could just ask a general question on technologies. Do we actually have enough technologies available to us today to achieve the target for 2030? Kerrie, what kind of technologies have we got that we can use? And are there technologies that exist that we're not using that we could now use?
Like wind is our greatest kind of our low-hanging fruit, if you will, of asset, and we onshore is certainly contributing greatly, and offshore is being developed and is ramping up, and that is it hasn't reached its full potential yet, but the path is paved to get there. Yep.
Yeah. I just want, Peter, from your international experience, are there technologies that people are using in other countries that perhaps we could use in Ireland?
There are a huge number of technological options out there, but it's not just technology, it's also know-how, it's best practice. We could get much, if not all of the way to net zero with known best practices, known technologies today. But there is a huge innovation potential space. There is huge potential to realize things. For example, wave energy is theoretically possible to be created at low cost. It's not been proven yet. If Ireland, for example, were to crack that nut, how many countries have a coastline and would be able to deploy wave energy? What would be the potential there? So there are many technologies and practices that can get us much of the way there, but that doesn't mean that the innovation window is closed. There is a huge innovation potential, a huge export potential of know-how, technology, practices, if we bite this and pull this in. And coming back to a point you made earlier about the circular economy effectively, I mean, what we've got to recognize is at the moment we pump out millions of euros a week to pay for our fossil fuel habit. And where does that go? That goes to various regimes in various countries that we would not be choosing to give money to. If we bite the bullet and take this challenge on, we can invest in indigenous technology, indigenous energy production. We can recycle that money into the national economy, which increases taxes, which means we can do more. It is madness that we are throwing millions of euros out of the economy to countries we would not wish by choice to be doing business with.
Valid comment. I'm sure, Brian, you have some technology options in your pocket that you're ready to pull out.
Well, I think, you know, in the first instance, we're going to be looking at how much harder we can push on some of the pieces that are in the 2019 Climate Action Plan. But then there are definitely other things that will have a bigger role. I mean, we need to look more at biomethane and biomass, potentially for power generation, what role carbon capture and storage might have, looking at building out green hydrogen production. Peter mentioned already the land use strategy. I think accelerating the completion of that will be quite important. What role district heating will have. So there are a lot of things that we can start to look at to build on the 2019 Climate Action Plan, but we're very much at the stage at the moment of putting everything on the table like a jigsaw and trying to understand how to put all the pieces together in the best way possible.
Yes, well, it is a challenge indeed. One final question just before we finish. We need to bring the population with us. If there was one thing you could each do in terms of communication to the population, what would it be? So ladies first, Kerrie, maybe I could start with you.
I guess it really, like, there's a lot of opportunity here, so it's really to hammer home how the benefits. I think everybody has discussed it in their presentations, and from the introduction earlier on with John and the Minister, there really is a benefit to transitioning and to embracing, and I think just keep hammering that same message home, and then as it gains traction, showing people how nothing to be afraid of, and it's the way forward.
Great. Peter, what would your best wish be?
I think it would be, I mean, we've hammered home the climate science message, and it's clearly having limited traction. So it's about communicating the co-benefits of climate action, communicating about what you like, how much better your life would be in that carbon-free world, by showcasing nationally and internationally what is possible. So we've got to be more effective fundamentally at communicating the benefits of action to individuals, to communities, to the nation as a whole. So that would be my wish.
And Brian, the last word?
To flip it around a bit, I think I'd like to actually listen more and listen better. I think there's a desire with a lot of people to do the right thing and to understand why that desire isn't being translated one step further to buying the EV, or to retrofitting the house, or to fitting a heat pump, to really understand what's blocking people going that step further, and to see, can we design policies to empower them to make those decisions?
Well, that's a real challenge, and that's one that I think we will all have to take on board as we go forward. We're running out of time, so I'm going to thank you all very much indeed. Firstly, for your presentations, which were really informative, and secondly, for the questions. And I hope that those who posted their questions got an answer, at least in some part, to their questions. I think the direction of travel is clear. It's going to be a bumpy road, but as the Minister says, it's an opportunity, and I think we're all up for that opportunity. So thank you all very much indeed. The session is now closed. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes, and session 2 will commence at 11:30. Thank you all very much indeed.